My wife cheated, and my own mom defended her. So I cut them off and walked away. I'm 49 now, and looking back, everything kind of started falling apart about 10 years ago. At the time, I was married to my wife Karen, and we had two kids, my daughter Sarah, who was 12, and my son Mike, who was 9. We were living in Texas, where we had a pretty decent life. We even had a small family business that we ran for years, but then the economy tanked, and well, everything went downhill from there. See, back then, there was this huge financial mess called the Great Recession. It was everywhere on the news, and people were losing their jobs, houses, everything. Our business didn't survive either, and honestly, I felt like I was sinking. I was trying to keep things together, but no matter what I did, it seemed like I couldn't catch a break. Our savings were getting eaten up, and there were times when I didn't know how we were going to pay the bills. I remember feeling the pressure on my shoulders every single day, and I knew I had to do something different if we were going to make it. So when I got offered a job overseas in Dubai, I jumped at it. It wasn't an easy decision. In fact, it was probably the hardest one I ever made. But it was a big opportunity, and we needed the money. I remember sitting down with Karen and telling her about the offer. I told her it was the only way to get us back on our feet, and she seemed to understand. But there was this look in her eyes, like she wasn't entirely convinced. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just worried about the move and being apart. Anyway, I packed my bags and headed to Dubai, promising Karen and the kids that I'd visit home every 6 months. The plan was to set up shop there, earn enough money, and eventually move back once things were more stable. I wasn't happy about leaving, but I kept telling myself that it was for them, that I was doing the right thing. Trying to be the good husband and dad, taking care of the family, all that. The first few months were tough. Dubai was a whole new world, different culture, different everything. But I threw myself into the work. I worked long hours, built connections, and slowly, things started picking up. It was lonely, though. I mean, it's one thing to be busy all day, but coming home to an empty apartment night after night gets to you. I missed my family like crazy, and the only thing that kept me going was the thought that one day I'd be back home with them. I kept my promise and flew back every 6 months. I tried to squeeze in as much time with the kids and Karen as I could, but it wasn't the same. Sarah and Mike were growing up, and I felt like I was missing out on their lives. Karen, well, she seemed distant. At first, I thought it was just because she was stressed from handling everything alone, managing the house, the kids, and everything else. I mean, it's a lot for one person. So I didn't push her on it. I figured she needed time to adjust, just like I did. But every time I came back, it felt like there was this wall between us. I'd suggest that maybe they could move to Dubai with me, now that things were going well and I had a place set up. But Karen wasn't interested. She kept saying the kids were doing well in school, and that she didn't want to pull them away from their friends. I got it. Nobody wants to uproot their kids. But a part of me wondered if there was more to it. Still, I let it slide. I didn't want to cause any more stress, especially with everything we'd already been through. When the kids finally finished high school and started college in Houston, I brought it up again. I figured it was the perfect time for Karen to join me. The kids were grown and they had their own lives now, so why not? But again, she shot down the idea. This time, she said she didn't want to leave her mom alone, that it would be too much for her to handle. I suggested that we could bring her mom with us to Dubai, make it a fresh start for all of us, but she just wasn't interested. At this point, I started to feel something wasn't right. I mean, I'd done everything I could. I built a life for us out there, and I was ready to have my family back, but she seemed like she didn't want to be with me at all. I kept trying to convince myself that she just needed more time, that maybe she was scared of the change, but deep down, it didn't sit well. I remember the last visit I made before everything started to really go south. I had this big plan, this idea that I was going to shut down the business in Dubai and move back to Texas for good. I thought it was the answer to all our problems. I mean, if the issue was distance, then the solution was simple, right? Just close up shop, head home, and everything would be fine. I thought she'd be happy, relieved even. But when I told her, she didn't react the way I expected. She seemed irritated, almost like she was annoyed with me. She said, "Why would you do that? You've worked so hard to set everything up there, and now you just want to throw it all away?" I was confused. I thought she'd be excited for me to come back, for us to finally be together as a family again. But instead, it felt like she didn't even want me there. That's when I started feeling this knot in my stomach, like maybe I was missing something. It wasn't just her reaction that threw me off. A day later, my mom called me up telling me the exact same thing, telling me not to rush back and that I was making a mistake by closing the business. Now, I hadn't mentioned my plans to anyone but Karen, so I knew she must have talked to my mom about it. I tried not to read into it too much, but it felt like they were plotting something together. It made me doubt my decision and everything else. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe I was just looking for answers that weren't there. After that, I decided to drop the idea of moving back, at least for a while. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd go days without calling, just to see if Karen would reach out, but she didn't. Our conversations became quick and to the point, almost like we were just checking off a box. I'd ask about the kids, she'd tell me they were fine, and that was it. It felt like we were strangers living separate lives. I tried bringing it up a few times, asking if she was happy or if she felt like something was wrong between us, but she'd always brush it off. She'd say I was overthinking and that everything was fine, but it didn't feel fine. I kept telling myself I was just stressed out from work, that the distance was messing with my head, but deep down, I knew something was changing. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. So, after that last visit, things really started to change between Karen and me. It's like all those small doubts I had were suddenly getting bigger, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I mean, I'd come back home expecting things to feel normal, but they didn't. It felt like I was some stranger dropping by instead of a husband coming home to his wife. Every time I left, I'd hoped that the next trip would be different, but it never was. Karen and I started talking less and less. It was weird, and honestly, a bit painful. I'd send a text, and sometimes it'd take her hours, even days, to respond. When we did talk, it was all just surface level stuff. She'd tell me about how the kids were doing, or how her mom was, but she never really talked about herself. And when I asked, she'd just brush it off like her life didn't matter. Everything's fine, she'd say. But it didn't feel fine. It felt like she was keeping me at arm's length, and I didn't know why. I started testing things. I'd go a whole day without messaging her, just to see if she'd notice or ask what was going on. But most of the time, she didn't even seem to care. Days turned into weeks where our communication was barely anything beyond a quick, "How's it going?" or "Kids are fine." I could feel the distance between us getting wider, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd just tell me I was being paranoid. She'd say I was overthinking everything and that we were fine. But I didn't believe it. One time, I asked her straight up if she still wanted to be with me. It was one of those late-night calls when you just can't hold it in anymore. I was tired of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. But instead of reassuring me, she got defensive. She said, "Why would you even ask that? Of course, I want to be with you." But the way she said it felt like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Then there was this one weird thing that really got to me. Karen started becoming super protective of her phone. Now, before, she was never like that. She'd leave her phone lying around, and it was no big deal. But lately, she wouldn't even let it out of her sight. Even when we were on video calls, if her phone went off, she'd make some excuse and turn off the camera or say she had to go. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't help but feel like she was hiding something. There was this one time when I came back for a short visit. I was only home for a week, and I noticed she'd always keep her phone face down or take it with her even if she just left the room for a minute. It was little stuff, but it added up. I tried to play it off, thinking maybe she was just being more careful, but it didn't sit right with me. When I asked her why she was acting weird with her phone, she just laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid again. "You've been gone so long you're starting to imagine things," she joked. But it didn't feel like a joke. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. It's not like I wanted to think that way about her. I'd trusted Karen for years, and we'd been through a lot together. But everything was adding up, and it was hard to ignore. I mean, we'd spent over a decade married, and I thought I knew her better than anyone. But now, I wasn't so sure. What really got to me was how distant she was becoming. Not just emotionally, but physically. I tried to get close to her during that visit, hug her, kiss her, but she felt cold. Like she'd go through the motions, but it was like she was holding back. At one point, I even asked her if something was wrong, but she just shrugged me off. "I'm just stressed," she said. "There's a lot going on with the kids, and your mom's not doing great." She always had an excuse. It felt like she was putting up walls, and no matter how hard I tried to break them down, she wouldn't let me in. It made me start questioning everything. Was it me? Was it the distance? Or was there something else going on? Around that same time, my mom started acting weird too. She'd call me up out of nowhere, asking how things were going and giving me advice I didn't ask for. She told me I needed to focus on my business in Dubai and not worry so much about what was happening back home. Now, I love my mom, but it felt like she was reading from Karen's script. It was almost like they were in on something together. I know that sounds paranoid, but when your gut's telling you something's off, it's hard to ignore. One night, after a long day of work in Dubai, I was sitting alone in my apartment, thinking about everything. I was feeling really torn. On one hand, I wanted to believe that Karen and my mom were just worried about me and trying to help. On the other, it felt like they were pushing me away, and I didn't know why. I even started to wonder if Karen had found someone else. I mean, why else would she act so distant? But then I'd feel guilty for thinking that way. She was my wife. If I couldn't trust her, then who could I trust? Still, the doubt was eating at me. I started paying more attention to everything she said, every little detail, trying to find clues that would prove or disprove what I was feeling. But she was careful. Too careful, if you ask me. And every time I brought up my concerns, she'd just brush them off or change the subject. There was this one moment that really stuck with me. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while she was in the kitchen. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up right away. But instead of reading the message, she looked up at me. It was like she was checking to see if I noticed. When she realized I was watching, she quickly put her phone away and went back to cooking. I remember feeling this knot in my stomach like something wasn't right. I asked her later who it was, and she just said it was her mom, but the way she avoided my eyes when she said it made me feel like she was lying. The distance between us kept growing. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the one messing things up by being so far away. But then I'd remind myself that I was out here for them, for Karen and the kids. It wasn't like I wanted to be gone. I was just trying to do the best I could to provide for them. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. I started feeling isolated, like I was stuck in some kind of limbo, where I couldn't go back, but couldn't move forward either. Every time I thought about packing up and moving back to Texas, I'd hear Karen's voice in my head, telling me I was being too hasty. I'd think about my mom's warnings, and I'd second guess myself all over again. It was like I was trapped, not knowing what the right move was. In the end, I decided to stay put in Dubai for a while longer, trying to keep my mind focused on work. But even then, it was like my heart wasn't in it anymore. I'd get up, go through the motions, and come home to an empty apartment every night. And all the while, the doubt kept growing, clawing at the back of my mind, making me wonder if I was missing something right in front of me. I reached a point where I couldn't take it anymore. The doubt, the distance, and the constant feeling that something was wrong, it all got to me. Every day I felt like I was walking around with a weight on my shoulders, and the more I tried to push it away, the heavier it got. I knew something was going on, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just in my head, it didn't feel like that. So I made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening, one way or another. I booked a ticket home, but didn't tell anyone. Not Karen, not my mom, not even the kids. I figured if I was wrong, then great, but if I was right, at least I'd know for sure. And honestly, the not knowing was worse than anything else. When I landed in Texas, I was anxious. My mind was racing, and I kept thinking about all the possibilities, everything I might find. I got to the house early in the morning, using the spare key to let myself in. The place was quiet, and for a second I thought maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe Karen had just been tired or stressed, and I'd been blowing things out of proportion. But then, as I walked through the house, I noticed small things that felt off. There were things out of place, like Karen's clothes folded neatly on the couch instead of in the bedroom, and her phone charger left plugged into the kitchen wall when she always kept it by the bed. It was small stuff, but enough to make my nerves spike. I kept telling myself to calm down, but every step I took felt like I was getting closer to something I wasn't ready to face. Then I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. I turned the corner and saw Karen standing there, looking completely shocked to see me. Her reaction was everything I needed to know. She froze for a moment, and then she forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you're home early," she said, trying to play it off like she was happy to see me. But I could tell she wasn't. I kept it casual. I told her I had a light workload for the month and thought it'd be a nice surprise to come home and spend some time together. She went along with it, but the whole time, I could see how tense she was. She was asking questions, almost too many, about why I didn't tell her I was coming and how long I planned to stay. It was like she was trying to figure out how much time she had to prepare or hide something. I shrugged it off, but inside I knew she was hiding something. Over the next couple of days, I paid close attention to everything. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't suspicious, but I watched every move she made. I noticed she was still being weird with her phone, always keeping it close, always checking it when she thought I wasn't looking. It was almost like she was waiting for a message or trying to hide who she was talking to. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I started snooping. When she was asleep or in the shower, I'd check her phone, but she had it locked up tight. No messages, no missed calls, nothing out of the ordinary. It was like she had wiped everything clean. I felt like an idiot, but it just made me more determined to get to the bottom of it. One night, while she was out running errands, I decided to take things a step further. I put a GPS tracker in her car. I know, it's extreme, and it's not something I'm proud of, but I needed answers. I couldn't live with the constant doubt anymore, and if she was up to something, I wanted to know for sure. The first couple of times I tracked her, everything seemed normal. She'd go to the grocery store, visit her mom's place, or pick up some stuff from the pharmacy. But then, one day I saw her go to this small hardware store across town. It was a place I'd never heard her mention before, and I'd never seen her go there during my visits. I waited, thinking maybe she was just grabbing some supplies or whatever, but she stayed there for a long time. I drove over, parked a few blocks away, and watched from a distance. The place looked closed, lights off and everything, but Karen's car was parked out front. After a while, the store owner came out and looked around, almost like he was checking if anyone was watching. Then he pulled down the shutters with Karen still inside. My heart sank. I knew right then that I was onto something, but I needed more proof. I followed her again a few days later. Same routine. She went to the hardware store, and the owner shut the place down as soon as she walked in. This time I stayed longer, waiting to see if anything would happen. I felt this anger bubbling up inside me, but I had to keep my cool. If I went in guns blazing without any solid proof, she'd just lie or come up with some excuse. A couple of days later, I decided to test the waters. I casually asked Karen about the store, pretending like I saw it while driving past. She hesitated for a second, but then said she was helping out with some home improvement project for her mom. She said it so smoothly I almost believed her, but something in her eyes gave her away. It was like she was waiting to see if I'd buy her story. I just nodded and played along, but I knew she was lying. The next time I tracked her, I parked even closer. I watched as she got out of her car and met the store owner outside. They talked for a bit, and then I saw him put his arm around her. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. The way he pulled her close, it was like they were more than friends. My blood was boiling. I wanted to confront them right then and there, but I forced myself to wait. After they went inside and he pulled the shutters down again, I got out of my car and walked up to the store. I knocked on the door a few times, but there was no answer. I could hear movement inside, like they were scrambling. It took everything in me not to kick the door down, but I knew I had to play this smart. If I blew my cover now, I'd never get the truth. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and walked away, feeling more conflicted than ever. Part of me wanted to keep digging, to find out everything, but another part of me didn't want to know. I didn't want to face the reality that Karen, the woman I'd trusted for so long, was betraying me. But I had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting my worst fears. Over the next few days, I kept a closer eye on her. She had this routine, going out in the afternoons, sometimes visiting her mom, other times running errands. Every time she left, I followed. It was exhausting, but I needed to catch her slipping up. I needed that one piece of undeniable proof. It was like waiting for a storm to hit. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know when or how bad it would be. I just had to be ready. After everything I'd seen and all the doubts swirling in my head, I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch anymore. It was eating me up inside. All those times I'd convinced myself to stay calm, to play it smart, felt like they were only giving Karen more chances to cover her tracks. I had to do something, and I had to do it soon. So I made a plan to catch her in the act, and this time, there was no turning back. I kept tracking her movements for the next few days, trying to find a pattern. She had this habit of going out in the afternoons, saying she was visiting her mom or running errands, but I knew better now. I just needed to be ready for the right moment. Then, one day, everything lined up. She left the house, and her car's tracker led me straight to that same hardware store. I parked my car a block away, far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to keep an eye on the place. My heart was pounding as I watched her pull up, get out, and walk toward the store. The guy came out to greet her, and they exchanged a quick look before heading inside. Just like before, he pulled the shutters down, closing up shop with Karen still in there. This was it. I knew this was my chance. I got out of the car and walked up to the store, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and adrenaline. When I reached the door, I knocked hard. At first, there was no response, just silence. I banged again, louder this time, and finally the guy opened the door a crack. He looked surprised to see me, like he wasn't expecting any visitors, let alone me. "Where's Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the rage boiling up inside me. The guy hesitated, his eyes shifting like he was looking for a way out. He didn't say anything, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I pushed the door open and walked in, not giving him a chance to stop me. The store was dimly lit, and most of the shelves were covered with tarps, like the place wasn't even in business. I moved quickly through the aisles, following the sounds coming from the back. My heart was racing, and every step felt heavier than the last. Then I found her. Karen was there, in the storeroom, in a position I wish I could unsee. She looked up, and the shock on her face was everything I needed to know. She'd been caught. The moment froze for a second, everything crashing down on me at once. All the suspicion, all the doubt, it all became real. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there it was, right in front of me. The guy, her so-called friend, or whatever he was, tried to step in between us, but I wasn't having it. I lunged at him, shoving him out of the way, and yelled at Karen, demanding to know how long this had been going on. She was scrambling, pulling herself together, and for a moment, she just stared at me, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. She tried to say something, but her voice was shaky. The guy jumped back in, grabbing me by the arm, and things got heated real fast. We started shoving each other, and he tried to drag me out of the storeroom. Karen was yelling at both of us to stop, but everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. I managed to push him off and got one good punch in, knocking him back. I could feel the anger and betrayal driving every move I made. Karen finally stepped in between us, telling the guy to back off. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to leave, saying we could talk about this later at home. But I wasn't leaving without answers. "Why, Karen?" I demanded. "How long have you been doing this?" I could barely keep my voice steady. The anger was mixing with this awful, sinking feeling of betrayal, and I needed to know why. Karen stood there, wiping her eyes, and finally, she started to speak. "It's not what you think," she said, but I wasn't having any of it. "How long?" I shouted again, and she flinched, finally admitting, "It's been a few years, okay? But it doesn't mean anything." A few years. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was standing there, acting like it was no big deal, like this wasn't the complete destruction of our marriage. I couldn't even look at her. I felt my whole body go numb. "A few years?" I repeated, more to myself than to her. "All this time and you just kept lying to me?" She tried to explain, saying something about how lonely she'd been and how hard it was with me gone for so long. She said she didn't want to hurt me, but she didn't know how to cope with the distance. It was excuse after excuse, and I just stood there, letting the words wash over me. None of it mattered. The fact was, she chose to betray me instead of being honest. I looked at the guy, and he had this smug look on his face, like he thought he'd gotten away with something. "You need to leave," I told him, my voice barely above a growl. "This is between me and my wife." He hesitated, and I stepped forward, making it clear I wasn't going to let him stay. Finally, he backed off, muttering something under his breath as he left the storeroom. Karen tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. "Don't," I said. "Just don't." She started crying again, pleading with me to go home with her so we could talk, but I wasn't in the mood for talking. I felt like my whole world had come crashing down, and there was no going back from this. She kept saying she was sorry, that it wasn't what I thought, but I didn't want to hear it. "You had years to tell me the truth," I said. "You had years to fix this, and instead you chose this guy over our marriage." She didn't know what to say. She just stood there, crying, while I felt everything I'd built with her slip away. All the trust, all the love. It felt like it had been torn to shreds in that moment. I told her I needed space, that I couldn't be around her right now. She tried to protest, but I was done listening. I walked out of that store, not looking back, and drove straight to my mom's house. My head was spinning, and all I could think about was how everything had fallen apart. I needed answers, and if Karen wasn't going to give them to me, then maybe my mom would. When I got to her place, I didn't waste any time. I walked in, and the first thing I said was, "You knew, didn't you?" My mom tried to act surprised, but I could see right through it. "Don't lie to me," I told her. "You knew about Karen's affair." She just sat there looking guilty, and that was all the confirmation I needed. She started to cry, saying she didn't want to tell me because she thought it would destroy everything. "You think this doesn't hurt?" I shot back. "Keeping it from me, pretending everything was fine, how is that any better?" My mom reached for my hand, telling me she was sorry, but I couldn't handle it. I pulled away, feeling like I'd been betrayed all over again, not just by Karen but by my own family. I felt like I didn't know who I could trust anymore. I told her I needed to be alone, and before she could say anything else, I walked out. I needed space to process everything, to figure out what I was going to do next. My marriage was falling apart, and my family had lied to me. It felt like everything I thought I knew had been ripped away, and I didn't know where to go from there. After leaving my mom's place, I drove around for hours, not knowing where to go or what to do next. My head was a mess, and everything felt like it was spinning out of control. I mean, how was I supposed to process all of this? My wife had been cheating on me for years, and my own mother had known about it and said nothing. It was like every single thing I believed in had been flipped upside down. I ended up parking by a small park we used to take the kids to when they were little. I sat there, staring at nothing, feeling like I was stuck in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Part of me wanted to go back to the house, to confront Karen again, to scream and yell and demand why she had thrown away everything we'd built together. But another part of me felt drained, like I didn't have the energy for it anymore. I was just done. For the next couple of days, I stayed at a cheap motel. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I needed time to think, to figure out what my next move was going to be. Karen was blowing up my phone with calls and texts, begging me to come back so we could talk, but I ignored her. She had her chance to be honest, and she blew it. I wasn't ready to hear any more of her excuses. My mom tried reaching out too, leaving voicemails, saying she was worried about me and that she was sorry. But every time I listened to her voice, all I could think about was how she'd looked me in the eye and lied, pretending everything was fine when she knew the truth. I couldn't get past that. It felt like my own family had betrayed me, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive her for that. On the third day, I decided to pack my bags and head to Houston. My daughters were there, living on their own, and I needed to see them. They were grown now, but they deserved to know what was going on. I didn't want Karen getting to them first and twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. I'd seen enough of that already, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate our kids. When I got to Houston, I met up with them at a coffee shop. They were happy to see me at first, but then they saw the look on my face, and I could tell they knew something was wrong. We sat down and I told them everything, the affair, how long it had been going on, and how my mom had known the whole time. I watched their faces change as the reality of it hit them. My oldest daughter, Sarah, was angry. She said she always had this weird feeling about her mom, that sometimes things didn't add up. She even mentioned seeing Karen act a little too friendly with some guy when she'd visited home once, but she brushed it off, thinking it was nothing. Now, it all made sense to her. My younger one, Mike, was quieter. He seemed hurt and confused, like he didn't know how to process it all. I could tell he was trying to stay strong, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He'd always been closer to Karen, and I knew this was going to hit him harder. I felt awful seeing my kids go through this, knowing that the family they thought they had wasn't real. It felt like I'd failed them somehow, like I should have seen the signs sooner. Sarah said she was done with her mom. She didn't want to hear any excuses and told me she'd already blocked Karen's number. She was furious, and honestly, I didn't blame her. But Mike, he was more torn. He didn't want to cut off his mom, even after everything. I told him it was his choice. I wasn't going to force him to take sides, but I reminded him to be careful. I knew Karen, and I knew she'd try to twist things to get him on her side. After I talked to the kids, I drove back to the house. I figured it was time to face Karen again and deal with whatever came next. I needed to figure out where we were headed and what the future looked like now that everything was out in the open. When I walked in, Karen was waiting for me, sitting at the kitchen table. She looked like a mess, red eyes, tissues everywhere, but I wasn't feeling sorry for her. She got up when she saw me and tried to hug me, but I stepped back. "We need to talk," I said, and she nodded, sitting back down. We sat there for what felt like ages, just staring at each other. Finally, she started talking. She went on about how she felt lonely all those years I was away, how she was struggling, and how she made a mistake. She tried to make it sound like it was just some meaningless thing, like she was doing it to fill the void, but I wasn't buying it. "You had years to tell me the truth," I said. "Years, and instead you chose to lie." She kept apologizing, saying she never meant to hurt me, and that she didn't want to lose me, but the more she talked, the more I realized she was just scared of losing her comfortable life. It wasn't about me. It was about the security and the money. I could see right through her now, and all the trust I used to have in her was gone. I asked her how many people knew about the affair. She hesitated, and that told me everything. "My mom knew, right?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She nodded, saying that my mom found out a few years back but promised not to say anything. "She said she didn't want to ruin the family," Karen added. It felt like a punch to the gut. hearing that excuse again. It was like they thought keeping me in the dark was doing me a favor. At that point, I was done. I got up, grabbed my things, and told her I was leaving. She tried to follow me, crying and begging me to stay, but I couldn't even look at her anymore. I told her I needed space and that I wasn't coming back until I figured out what I wanted to do next. I wasn't ready to talk about divorce or what would happen to the house. I just needed to get out of there. I drove back to the motel, feeling a mix of anger and relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some control over my life again. I didn't know what the future was going to look like, but at least I was done pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. I decided to cut off Karen financially. If she wanted to stay in that house, she'd have to figure it out herself. I wasn't going to keep supporting her while she lived off my hard work and betrayed me behind my back. I called my daughters and told them what I was planning. Sarah was all for it. She said Karen needed to face the consequences of her actions. Mike was quieter, and I could tell he was struggling with it. I told him that it was his decision if he wanted to help his mom, but that I wasn't going to be part of it anymore. He needed to know the truth and make his own choices. So that's where things stand now. I'm still at the motel, trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wants to pack up and go back to Dubai, to put as much distance between myself and this mess as possible. But another part of me knows that running away won't solve anything. I need to face it head on, but I'm not sure how yet. For now, I'm just taking things one day at a time, trying to process everything and figure out what's best for me and my kids. I'll keep updating when I can, but honestly, I don't know how this is going to play out. All I know is that I'm done being taken for a fool, and I'm done letting other people decide my life for me.
The soft hum of jet engines filled the air as passengers settled into their seats for what seemed like an ordinary flight. Among them was a father, Marcus Taylor, a distinguished man with a calm demeanor, and his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie. It was a special trip for Sophie, her first flight in first class, an experience meant to be filled with excitement and wonder. Marcus, juggling the responsibilities of being both a dedicated father and the CEO of a major airline, decided to use this trip to combine work and quality time with his daughter. But what began as an innocent journey quickly turned into an experience that would test the limits of a father's love and a leader's resolve. Sophie, left in the care of a flight attendant while Marcus attended to a business meeting in economy, soon found herself the target of subtle cruelty and outright prejudice. What Sophie didn't know was that this wasn't just another flight, and her father wasn't just another passenger. When Marcus returned to check on Sophie and discovered the red marks on her arm, the look of fear in her eyes, and the disgraceful behavior of the flight attendant, his calm exterior shattered. He didn't just see an employee's failure to fulfill her duties, he saw an attack on his daughter's dignity and humanity. In that moment, Marcus wasn't the CEO of an airline. He was a father fighting to protect the most important person in his life. What happened next wasn't just about confronting an individual, it was about challenging an entire system and sending a message that no position, no uniform, and no title could ever excuse injustice. This story, brought to you by Real Life Stories New, is one of courage, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It's a reminder that even at 35,000 feet, the fight for respect and equality remains grounded in the values we hold dear. Stay with us as we share how a father's love became the catalyst for change across an entire industry. Sophie Taylor sat quietly by the window in her first-class seat, her small hands clutching her beloved stuffed elephant, Mr. Trunks. Her father, Marcus, had kissed her forehead and promised to check in soon. As the CEO of the airline, Marcus trusted that Sophie would be treated well, even while he attended an urgent meeting with investors in economy class. But Sophie's excitement quickly turned to unease when the flight attendant, Lauren, began treating her differently. Lauren's polished smile vanished the moment Marcus stepped out of sight. She barked sharp commands, ignored Sophie's polite requests, and made no effort to hide her disdain. When Sophie's ears hurt during takeoff, she pressed the call button for water, just as her father had instructed her to do. Lauren arrived with an irritated glare. "Service hasn't started yet," she snapped, turning off the button without another word. Sophie sat back quietly, trying not to cry as other passengers received drinks and warm smiles. Time dragged on. The cabin grew colder, and Sophie hesitantly pressed the call button again. This time, Lauren tossed a blanket onto Sophie's lap with a sarcastic remark about spoiled children. The girl struggled to open the plastic wrapper as Lauren muttered under her breath, loud enough for Sophie to hear, probably never heard the word "no" in her life. Sophie's discomfort deepened when lunch service began. The aroma of warm meals filled the air, but when Sophie asked softly if she could have something to eat, Lauren lied, claiming there were no meals left. A kind elderly woman nearby offered her own meal to Sophie, but Lauren curtly refused, citing policy. The minutes felt like hours as Sophie sat alone, cold, hungry, and trying to stay invisible. She had been so excited to join her dad on this trip, but now, all she wanted was to go home. Meanwhile, Marcus was wrapping up his meeting in economy. A growing unease gnawed at him. He had checked his watch repeatedly, realizing it had been far too long since he last saw Sophie. Apologizing to the investors, he made his way back to first class. As Marcus approached Sophie's seat, his heart sank. His lively, bright-eyed daughter was slumped in her chair, clutching Mr. Trunks, her once immaculate yellow dress now stained with spilled juice. Red marks peeked out from under her cardigan sleeve. Marcus crouched next to her, speaking softly. "Sophie, sweetheart, are you okay?" Before Sophie could respond, Lauren appeared, her demeanor suddenly cheerful and attentive. "Oh, Mr. Taylor. Sophie's been such a delightful passenger. I was just about to bring her a snack." Her sugary tone couldn't hide the fear in her eyes as Marcus looked between her and his daughter. He placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Sweetheart, have you eaten?" Sophie shook her head slightly, her gaze flickering nervously toward Lauren. "She had a lovely lunch earlier," Lauren interjected, her smile faltering. Marcus's gut told him something wasn't right. He gently pressed further. "Sophie, are you sure? You didn't eat much this morning?" Sophie's small voice trembled. "I'm fine, Daddy." Lauren excused herself hastily, claiming she would fetch juice. Marcus watched her retreat to the galley, his concern mounting. Then, as he stood to examine the stain on Sophie's dress, he noticed her wince. Gently, he rolled up her sleeve, revealing faint bruises on her arm. Anger surged through him, but he kept his tone calm. "Who did this, Sophie?" Tears welled in her eyes. "She said she'd hurt me more if I told you," Sophie whispered. Marcus's composure cracked. "Stay right here," he told Sophie firmly before striding toward the galley. Lauren didn't see him coming. "What did you do to my daughter?" Marcus's voice was low, but the anger was unmistakable. Passengers turned to watch as Lauren stumbled through excuses. I didn't mean any harm. She was being difficult." "She's 7, Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "A child, entrusted to your care. And you left her bruised and hungry." The cabin fell silent, tension thick in the air. The captain, alerted to the commotion, emerged from the cockpit. "Mr. Taylor, is everything all right?" "No," Marcus replied coldly, gesturing toward Lauren. "This flight attendant has been mistreating my daughter." Lauren's face turned ashen as passengers began to speak up. The businessman across the aisle admitted he had seen Lauren ignore Sophie's drink request. The elderly woman who had tried to share her meal recounted Lauren's refusal. The captain's face hardened. "Lauren, step away immediately. You're suspended from duty, effective now." By the time the plane landed, law enforcement was waiting at the gate. Lauren was arrested for assaulting a minor as passengers applauded Marcus's intervention. But for Marcus, the fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about his daughter, it was about every passenger who might face similar mistreatment. As Marcus cradled Sophie in his arms, he silently vowed that no child, no passenger, would ever endure what she had. This was the beginning of a battle that would not only reshape his airline but set a new standard across the entire industry. The skies were about to change, and it all began with one father who refused to stay silent. Walking out of the terminal with Sophie in his arms, Marcus Taylor felt the weight of what had happened. His daughter's bruises would heal, but the lessons from that flight would last forever. Determined to ensure no one else would suffer as Sophie had, Marcus channeled his love for her into action. In the weeks that followed, he spearheaded sweeping changes at his airline, introducing stricter hiring processes, empathy-driven crew training, and a passenger bill of rights to protect travelers. Marcus's commitment went beyond his company, inspiring other airlines to follow suit, creating an industry-wide movement for safety and respect. Sophie, with her father's support, regained her confidence, proud that her experience sparked change. "You made things better for everyone, Daddy," she said, her resilience shining. This story is a powerful reminder of the strength of love and courage in the face of injustice. It shows how one person's stand can inspire transformation and protect countless lives. What would you have done in Marcus's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories New. Help us reach 10,000 subscribers to continue sharing inspiring stories that make a difference. Thank you for watching and being part of this mission for kindness and justice.
Mom kicked me out for refusing to share my college fund with my step-sibling. So I'm 17, and I live with my mom, she's 43, her husband, my stepdad, and his two kids, Ryan and Emma. Ryan's a year older than me, and Emma's 2 years younger. We all go to the same high school, but that doesn't mean we actually hang out or anything. Like, we know each other's friends, but that's about it. My mom and stepdad have been married for 3 years now, but we've been living together for 6, ever since my mom decided she was serious about him. When we first moved in with them, I really thought it was going to be like one of those big happy family situations. You know, like, I'd have siblings now, and we'd all hang out and do family stuff together. But that didn't really happen. Honestly, I should have seen it coming from the start, but I guess I was too hopeful. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit that things wouldn't be all sunshine and rainbows. See, before my mom met my stepdad, it was just me and her. My dad passed away when I was really little, too little to remember anything about him. The only thing I know is from what my mom told me, and she's always been a little vague about him. She said they never got married because his family didn't like her much, which she blamed on them being stuck up. But I don't know. I was too young to know what really went down. Anyway, before he passed, my dad set up a college fund for me. I don't know how he managed to do it with how sick he was, but he did. His lawyer told me about it when I was old enough to understand, and I guess it's been this one thing that I've always had in the back of my mind. Like, no matter what happens, at least I've got that. It was set up so that I can't touch it until I turn 18, and my mom can't either. The lawyer controls it until then. So, like I said, it was just me and my mom for a long time. I got used to it, and we were good. She was my whole world, you know? We had this tiny apartment, but it was cozy, and it was just us. But then she met my stepdad when I was 8, and everything started to change. At first, it was slow. She'd go out on dates with him, and I'd stay over at my grandparents' place, my mom's parents, not my dad's. They've never been in the picture. I didn't mind it too much at the time because I figured she deserved to be happy, but then they got more serious. My mom started talking about moving in with him, and that's when things started to feel different. She was so excited, and she'd go on and on about how great he was and how his kids were such good kids and so nice. She kept telling me that I'd finally get siblings, and we'd be one big, happy family. I remember getting excited too because, what kid doesn't want that? When we finally moved into their house, I was trying really hard to be positive. It was a big change. New place, new school, and now I had a stepdad and 2 step-siblings to adjust to. But I thought it was going to work out if I just put in the effort. I'd try to talk to Ryan and Emma, invite them to play video games or watch movies, and sometimes they'd say yes, but most of the time, they'd just give me these looks like, "Why are you even here?" I'd brush it off at first, telling myself they just needed time to warm up. It was a lot for them too. Some random girl moving into their house and suddenly being told she was their new sister. But months went by, and nothing really changed. We lived together, but it wasn't like we were a family. It felt more like I was a roommate they didn't really want. It wasn't that they were mean or anything, but there was just this vibe, you know? Like they'd sit around the table talking with my stepdad and mom, and I'd be there. but it felt like I wasn't. They'd laugh about inside jokes I didn't get or talk about stuff from before I moved in, and when I'd try to join in, they'd kind of just ignore me. Not in a mean way, just like they didn't really care if I was there or not. And my mom? She didn't seem to notice at all. She was so happy with her new family that she didn't see how I was left out. It was weird seeing her like that, honestly. She'd never been that happy when it was just the two of us. I tried telling myself it was good that she was finally happy, but I started feeling more and more like an outsider. Over time, I just gave up trying. I'd stay in my room or go out with my own friends instead of trying to hang out with them. It felt pointless. My stepdad and his kids were polite enough, but there was this invisible wall between us, and I didn't have the energy to keep trying to break it down. It's like they had their family, and I wasn't really part of it, even if my mom was. What sucked the most was how my mom treated them. She'd go out of her way to make them happy, like cooking their favorite meals, taking them shopping, or making sure their rooms were perfect. Meanwhile, I'd get the leftovers, literally and figuratively. I didn't really say anything about it because what was the point? It wasn't like it'd change anything, but it hurt seeing her care so much about them and not even notice how I felt. When I was younger, I used to think, well, maybe if I try harder, they'll see me as part of the family. But as I got older, I realized that was just wishful thinking. It wasn't going to happen. They had their group, and I was on the outside looking in. And the thing is, I don't even think they did it on purpose. It was just how it was. Even now, I still try to tell myself that maybe I'm just overthinking things, but deep down, I know I'm not. My mom has a new family, and it feels like I'm just a reminder of her past life. It's like she's moved on from the days when it was just the two of us, and she's more focused on making her new family work. I guess I can't blame her for wanting to be happy, but it's tough when you're the one left out. It's been years since we moved in with them, and I've just accepted that things are never going to be the way I hoped. I've stopped trying to fit in, and I focus on my own thing. But there are days when it still gets to me, like when I see my mom laughing with them, and I'm sitting there feeling like I don't belong. I don't know. Maybe it's dumb to feel this way after all these years. Maybe I should just get over it. But it's hard when you're stuck in a house where you don't feel wanted. I guess the only thing that keeps me going is knowing that once I turn 18 and graduate, I'll have my own money, and I can finally get out of here. That college fund my dad left me is probably the one thing that makes me feel like I've got a future that doesn't involve them. Sometimes, when things get really bad, I just think about that. I imagine finally being able to move out, go to college, and live my own life without feeling like an outsider in my own home. All right, so things got a little more real around here when my stepdad's past came back into the picture. I guess it makes sense to explain what I mean by that. See, my stepdad had a whole other life before he met my mom. He was married, and from what I've heard, it wasn't exactly a happy situation. His ex-wife was this real piece of work, basically a gold digger who took him for everything he had, and then some. I didn't know all the details at first, but over the years I started piecing things together. Apparently, she not only drained his bank account, but also left him in a really bad spot with the kids, my stepbrother, Ryan, and my stepsister, Emma. She bailed on them right after the divorce, which is when my stepdad had to rebuild everything from scratch. I think that's why he latched onto my mom so hard. She was like the complete opposite of his ex. No drama, just there to support him, and always doing her best to make things work. It's no wonder why my stepdad and his kids welcomed her with open arms. She was the solution to all their problems. But me? I was just a reminder that she had a past life that didn't fit into their picture-perfect setup. It's like they wanted my mom to be part of their new family. But me? I was the extra baggage that came along for the ride. I'll admit, I wasn't really paying attention to all of this when we first moved in. I was just a kid, and my mind was more on making new friends at school and trying to adjust to a new place. But as I got older, I started noticing the small things, like how my mom and stepdad would talk about their future plans, things like vacations, home improvements, all the usual stuff, but it was always about them and their kids. I was never really part of those conversations. It was like I was there, but not really there, you know? Like, physically I was in the room, but they'd just kind of talk over me or around me like I was invisible. And honestly, it hurt more than I let on. I kept trying to tell myself it was just how things were, that it wasn't personal, but that got harder and harder over time. The thing is, my mom would never see it. She'd be all smiles, acting like everything was perfect. She'd gush about how lucky she was to have found this wonderful family and how happy she was. And I'd just sit there, watching her play this part that I wasn't invited to. Sometimes I wondered if she was just pretending, Like maybe she didn't see how they treated me because she didn't want to. But other times, I felt like she knew exactly what was going on and just didn't care because she was happy. One of the biggest things that bugged me was how different my stepdad and his kids treated my mom compared to how they treated me. With her, they'd go out of their way to include her in everything. Ryan would ask her advice about school projects, and Emma would ask her to go shopping for clothes. They'd all hang out in the living room together, watching movies or cooking dinner like this perfect little unit. But with me, they'd barely say a word. If I walked into a room, it was like I'd turned the lights off. Everyone would just kind of go quiet, and the vibe would get awkward. It's like they didn't know what to do with me. If I tried to join the conversation, they'd nod politely or give these one-word answers until I got the hint that they weren't interested. Eventually, I stopped trying to be part of it. I'd stay up in my room or go to the library after school instead of going home. It was easier to avoid them than to keep feeling like an outsider in my own house. It's a weird feeling, not wanting to go home because it doesn't even feel like home. It's just a place where I sleep and eat, but that's about it. Now you might think, why didn't you say something to your mom? And trust me, I thought about it a lot. But every time I got close to bringing it up, I'd chicken out. It felt like if I said anything, it'd just make me sound jealous or needy, like I couldn't handle my mom being happy without me. And I didn't want to be that person, the one who ruins everything because they can't handle a little change. So I stayed quiet. It got worse when I started hearing more stories about my stepdad's ex-wife. From what I picked up, she was a total nightmare. She not only drained his bank account, but also messed up his relationship with their kids. My stepdad had to work double shifts to pay off debts and support Ryan and Emma after she left. And then my mom came along, and she was like this miracle who saved the day. I think that's why they were so attached to her. She was their fix after years of struggling, and I was just the add-on they didn't ask for. It's like my stepdad and his kids were so relieved to have my mom in their lives that they didn't want to bother with me. And my mom? She was too busy playing the perfect stepmom to notice. I still tried to convince myself that things could change. I'd tell myself that maybe I just needed to give it time, that we'd eventually bond, and things would start to feel like a real family. But the more time passed, the more I realized it wasn't going to happen. My stepdad's kids had already decided that they didn't need another sibling, and my stepdad? Well, he was just happy as long as my mom was happy. One day, I overheard my stepdad talking to his friend in the kitchen. He was going on about how lucky he was to have found someone like my mom, and how his life had completely turned around since they got together. He called her a godsend, and the best thing that ever happened to him. I remember standing there, just out of sight, listening to all this praise he was showering on her, and I kept waiting for him to say something about me, like how it was nice having me around too or anything, really. But he didn't. He didn't mention me once. That's when it hit me hard. I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried, I was never going to be part of their picture. My mom had made her choice, and I wasn't a priority in that. It was like they had this perfect family dynamic that didn't include me, and they were all perfectly fine with that. I remember walking away from that conversation feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. It was one thing to feel like an outsider, but it was another thing to know that I really was one. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't just my imagination. They had their family, and I was just tagging along. From that point on, I started distancing myself even more. I'd eat dinner later so I didn't have to sit with them, or I'd make up excuses to stay out of the house as much as possible. It was easier that way. I didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't, but even with all that, I still felt this pressure to act like everything was okay. My mom was so happy with them, and I didn't want to mess that up for her. It was like she finally found what she was looking for, and who was I to ruin that? So I kept quiet, stayed out of their way, and pretended that it didn't bother me as much as it did. But deep down, it was getting harder to ignore the reality that this family my mom was so proud of was one I'd never be part of. And no matter how much I told myself it was okay, it still hurt like hell. Alright, so here's where things really start to go south. I'm getting close to graduating, and I've been looking at colleges for a while now. I've always known about the college fund my dad set up for me, so I wasn't too worried about money. I figured with the fund, I could afford to go pretty much anywhere I wanted. Plus, I've been working hard in school and had my eyes set on a scholarship. Basically, I had everything planned out. So one night, my mom calls me into the living room and says she needs to have a serious talk. I can tell from the way she's talking that it's going to be one of those family meetings, but it's just the two of us. She sits me down and starts going on about how expensive college is these days and how, we're all one family and have to support each other. I had no idea where she was going with this at first, but then she drops the bomb. She tells me that my stepdad hasn't been able to save up money for Ryan and Emma's college, and she thinks it'd be only fair if I shared my college fund with them. I just sat there staring at her, like she was speaking a different language or something. I was in shock. This was money my dad set up for me specifically, to make sure I'd be taken care of after he was gone. It's literally the only thing he could give me because he passed away when I was a kid. And now she was telling me to split it with kids who've never treated me like family, and honestly, don't even really like me. I felt my face getting hot, and I had this tight feeling in my chest. I knew she was waiting for me to say something, but I didn't know what to say. I think she took my silence as me being open to the idea because she kept going. She started talking about how we all need to pitch in, and it's what families do for each other. She even threw in how much Ryan and Emma could use the help since Ryan took a gap year and is now applying to colleges too. I finally snapped out of it and just told her, no. Straight up, no. I told her that I wasn't going to share my college fund with them because it wasn't meant for them. It was my dad's money, and he set it up for me, not anyone else. And honestly, why should I? We aren't close, and they've never made me feel like part of the family anyway. She didn't take that well at all. Her face went from this calm, I'm being reasonable look to pure anger in like 2 seconds. She called me selfish and said I wasn't thinking about the family. I was expecting this reaction, but it still stung. She's my mom, you know? And here she was, acting like I was some villain just because I wanted to keep the one thing my dad left me. I told her I was fine with being selfish. I told her I had no problem admitting it because, at the end of the day, that money was for me and me alone. If Ryan really wanted to go to college so bad, he could take out loans like every other kid who doesn't have a fund set up for them. I knew it sounded harsh, but I was done playing nice. That's when she really lost it. She started yelling, and not just the regular kind of yelling. This was full-on rage. She was going off about how ungrateful I was, how I didn't appreciate everything she and my stepdad had done for me. She said that if my dad could see me now, he'd be so disappointed. That one hit hard, but I wasn't going to back down. I just sat there and let her yell because I knew arguing wasn't going to get me anywhere. I tried to explain that it wasn't about being ungrateful, that it was about respecting my dad's wishes and taking care of myself. I mean, this fund was my ticket out of a situation where I felt like an outsider for years. But she wasn't hearing it. She was too worked up saying stuff like, "You think you're better than them, don't you?" And, "You only care about yourself." It took everything in me not to yell back. I was so frustrated. It's like, how could she not get that I needed this for my own future? She's supposed to be my mom, my biggest supporter. And here she was, making me out to be the bad guy because I wouldn't give up what was mine. And what really sucked was that she kept using the whole family thing as her main argument. Like, where was this family unity when they were all treating me like a stranger in my own home? I told her that yelling at me wasn't going to change anything. I said, look, you can yell all you want, but it's not going to make me feel bad about this. And honestly, it wasn't even about the money anymore. It was the principle of it all. How could she expect me to give up something so important for people who never treated me like one of them? She eventually stopped yelling, and we just stared at each other. I could see she was trying to figure out what to say next, but I wasn't going to give her the chance. I stood up and told her that if this was the hill she wanted to die on, then fine. I wasn't budging, and she wasn't going to guilt trip me into changing my mind. Then she said something that really threw me. She told me that if I didn't change my mind in a week, she'd have no choice but to kick me out. I remember just standing there, blinking, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was really threatening to throw me out over this? She said that since my birthday was coming up, and I'd be turning 18, she wouldn't be legally obligated to keep me anymore. So if I didn't share the fund, I'd be on my own. That's when it hit me. My own mom was willing to kick me out for these people. She was willing to throw her only kid out just to keep the peace with her new family. It was like a punch to the gut. I felt my eyes start to sting, but I wasn't about to cry in front of her. I told her, fine, if that's how you feel, I'll figure it out. I think she expected me to beg or plead with her, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I walked out of the room and went straight to my own. I was so angry and hurt that I could barely think straight. I just kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering how things got so messed up. I spent the rest of the night texting my friends, telling them what happened. I didn't really know what else to do. I felt trapped, like I had no options. But one of my friends was actually super helpful. She told me that if it came down to it, I could crash with her for a while. Another friend said they knew someone who was also looking for a roommate for college, so we could maybe room together when the time came. It felt like the walls were closing in, but at least I had some people who cared. At least I wasn't completely alone. but it still hurt knowing my mom would choose them over me. It felt like everything I thought I knew about her was wrong, and now I was stuck figuring out how to move forward when my whole world was upside down. After that blow up with my mom, things got tense. Like really tense. It felt like I was walking on eggshells every single day. Every time I walked into a room, the vibe just shifted. My mom didn't say much to me, but when she did, it was with this cold, almost robotic tone. I guess she was trying to make me feel bad or guilty, but by then, I was too angry to even care. A few days went by, and it was like I was invisible in my own house. My mom would talk to my stepdad and my step-siblings like everything was normal, like nothing had happened. They'd laugh and talk about their plans for the weekend, school stuff, and whatever else. And me? I'd sit there eating my cereal, pretending not to care. But it was impossible to ignore how they just acted like I wasn't even there. I guess I had gotten used to feeling like an outsider, but now it was different. It felt like they were all actively ignoring me, like they were all in on it together. I spent most of my time in my room trying to come up with a plan. My birthday was coming up fast and the clock was ticking. I knew that as soon as I turned 18, my mom could legally kick me out. And judging by how she'd been acting, she had every intention of following through with that threat. I started packing up my stuff a little at a time, trying to prepare for whatever came next. It felt surreal, packing my life into boxes while the people downstairs carried on like nothing was happening. One night, my mom finally confronted me again. She knocked on my door, and when I opened it, she just stood there with her arms crossed, looking tired and annoyed. "Have you thought about what I said?" she asked, like she was already expecting me to give her the answer she wanted. I told her, "Yeah, I've thought about it, and I'm not changing my mind." The look she gave me was pure disbelief, like she couldn't believe I was actually standing my ground. But what did she expect? This was the only thing I had left from my dad, and I wasn't about to give it up just to make her and her new family happy. She sighed and did that thing where she rubs her forehead like she's got a headache, which was her classic "I'm so stressed" move. She said, "If you're really going to be this stubborn, then you leave me no choice." She didn't yell this time. She was calm, and somehow that made it worse. She told me I had 1 week. 1 week to change my mind or find somewhere else to live. "This isn't a threat, it's just how it has to be," she said, like she was being the reasonable one. I felt my stomach drop. Hearing her say it so calmly, so matter-of-fact, made it all too real. I just nodded because honestly, what was I supposed to say? I wasn't going to beg, and I definitely wasn't going to change my mind. I knew she had made up her mind too, and there was no going back. We were at a stalemate, and neither of us was going to back down. After she left my room, I just sat there for a while trying to process everything. I felt like my world was crumbling, but at the same time, I was just numb. It's weird when you've been so angry for so long that you just stop feeling anything. It was like I was watching everything happen to someone else, not me. That's when I decided I needed to get out, no matter what. If my own mom was willing to kick me out over this, then it was clear I couldn't stay there any longer. I reached out to a few friends, telling them the whole story. It was embarrassing to admit what was going on, but I didn't have any other options. I needed a place to stay, at least until college started. Thankfully, my friends were amazing. One of my best friends, Sarah, said I could stay with her for as long as I needed. Her mom even offered to help me figure out a plan. It was a relief knowing I had somewhere to go, but it was also a reality check. This was really happening. I was going to be kicked out by my own mom, and there was no going back. The next few days were a blur. I started packing the rest of my stuff, boxing up my clothes, books, and whatever else I could fit. I felt like I was racing against the clock, but at the same time, there was this weird sense of freedom. Like, yeah, it sucked that I was being forced out, but at least I had control over where I was going next. I could finally be done with pretending to be part of a family that didn't want me. During this time, my stepdad and step-siblings were completely silent. They knew what was happening. My mom must have told them. But they didn't say a word to me. It's like they were all just waiting for me to disappear. I guess they were hoping I'd leave quietly, without making a scene. Part of me wanted to say something, to call them out for how they'd treated me all these years. But what was the point? It wouldn't change anything. They'd still go on pretending like I never existed. One morning I was packing up my books when my mom walked in. She stood there, watching me for a moment before saying, "You know, you're making this harder than it has to be." I just kept packing. I didn't even look at her because I knew if I did, I might lose my cool. She went on, talking about how it was heartbreaking to see me throw my life away over something as small as money. That really pissed me off. Small? This was everything my dad had left me. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how messed up it was that she was choosing them over me, but I knew it wouldn't matter. So I just said, "This isn't about money, and you know it." She rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic. "Fine, if that's how you want to see it. But you're making a mistake, and one day you'll regret this." And with that, she walked out. I felt this wave of anger and sadness hit me all at once. It was like everything I'd held back for years finally broke through, but instead of breaking down, I just kept packing. I wasn't going to let her see how much it hurt. She'd already shown me where her priorities were, and there was no point in pretending things would ever be different. I had to take care of myself because clearly, no one else was going to do it for me. The day before my birthday, I had all my stuff packed and ready to go. Sarah and her mom came over to help me move everything out. It felt weird, like I was running away, but at the same time, it was a relief. I knew that leaving was the only way I was ever going to be free from all this. My mom didn't even come out to say goodbye when we left. I remember looking back at the house one last time, half expecting her to show up at the door, but she never did. It was just empty. And in that moment, I realized that leaving wasn't the end of the world. It was a new start. I had my friends, my plans for college, and my own future ahead of me. And even though it hurt, I knew it was better than staying in a place where I was never truly welcome. So I left, packed my stuff, walked out of the house, and moved in with my friend Sarah and her family. It was weird, you know. I felt this huge mix of emotions, part relief, part sadness, and a whole lot of anger. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of feeling like I had to prove my worth in my own house. Tired of everything. But at the same time, leaving felt like the right choice, even if it hurt like hell. Sarah's family was awesome. They didn't make me feel like a burden or like I was some kind of charity case. They welcomed me, no questions asked. Her mom gave me this big hug when I showed up, and honestly, it was the first time in a while that I felt like someone actually cared. I'm not usually the hugging type, but I think I needed it more than I realized. Living there was a huge change. It felt like everything was moving in fast forward. I had to get used to not having my own space, sharing a room with Sarah, and getting back into a normal routine. I mean, I'd just been kicked out of my own house, so I had to adjust to a whole new life. But as crazy as it sounds, it was kind of freeing too. I didn't have to walk on eggshells anymore or feel like I was the odd one out. I could just exist. The weirdest part was how quiet things got with my mom. For the first couple of days after I left, I didn't hear anything from her. No calls, no texts, nothing. It was like I'd vanished off her radar. Part of me was relieved, but another part of me kept checking my phone, half hoping she'd say something. Anything. I know it's stupid, but I guess I was still holding on to the hope that she'd reach out, apologize, and say she didn't mean it. But she didn't. I kept telling myself it was better this way. At least she wasn't yelling at me or trying to guilt trip me anymore. But as the days went by, it just felt like proof that she didn't care. She really chose them over me, and now that I was gone, she didn't even bother to check if I was okay. But then, about a week after I'd moved out, I finally got a message. I saw her name pop up on my phone and my stomach did this weird flip. For a second, I thought maybe she was reaching out to make things right, but nope. She sent this long text about how I needed to come back and get the rest of my stuff, or she'd throw it all out. There was no, "How are you?" or "I'm sorry." Just business. Just cold. I replied and told her I'd pick up my stuff, but I didn't need her to be there when I did. I didn't want another fight, and I definitely didn't want to see her if all she was going to do was lecture me about how selfish I was. She said that was fine and told me she'd leave my things in the garage for me to grab. When I showed up to get my stuff, the house felt different. It's hard to explain, but it felt emptier, colder. My things were all crammed into these cheap trash bags like I was nothing more than a bunch of junk she was throwing out. I had to hold back tears as I dragged the bags into Sarah's car. It was one of those moments where everything just hits you all at once, like, wow, this is really my life now. But the real gut punch came when I found out that she'd already given my room to Emma. I noticed it when I walked by and saw her stuff spread out across the bed that used to be mine. She was redecorating it, putting up new posters and everything. It was like I'd been erased, like I never even existed there. I didn't say anything to her, and she didn't say anything to me. She just glanced up, saw me, and went right back to what she was doing. I walked out of that house feeling more alone than ever, but at the same time, I felt this weird sense of closure. It was like, okay, this is it. This is what it is now. They've moved on, and so should I. Back at Sarah's place, I dumped the bags in the corner of the room and sat there for a while just staring at them. I couldn't bring myself to unpack. It felt like unpacking meant accepting everything that had happened, and I wasn't ready for that yet. But Sarah, being the amazing friend she is, didn't push me. She just sat with me, talked about random stuff to get my mind off it, and eventually convinced me to grab some takeout with her. Over the next few days, things got a bit better. I started to settle into a routine again, and Sarah's family made me feel like I belonged. Her mom even helped me start looking for part-time jobs so I could save up for when I eventually moved out on my own. It felt good to have people who were actually on my side. But the drama wasn't quite over. One day my mom showed up at Sarah's house. I was in the middle of studying when Sarah's mom called me downstairs. The moment I saw my mom standing there, I knew it wasn't going to be good. She had this look on her face, like she was determined but also angry. She demanded to talk to me, and before I could even respond, she started going off about the post I made on social media. I had vented about everything, how she kicked me out, how I felt like I was never really part of the family. It got a lot of attention, and apparently some of her friends had seen it. She was furious. "You need to take that down," she shouted. "You're making me look bad, and it's not fair." I felt my blood boil. "Fair?" I shot back. "You kicked me out, remember? You chose them over me, and now you're mad because people know?" She didn't want to hear it. She kept going on about how I was making things worse for her, and how it was my fault she was losing friends over this. She even had the nerve to say I was being immature and dramatic for posting it. By then, I was done. I told her I wasn't taking anything down and that she needed to leave. Sarah's mom backed me up, telling her that if she kept yelling, she'd call the police. My mom stormed off, but not before saying, "You'll regret this one day. When they're all gone and you have no one left, don't come crawling back to me." That one hurt, but I stood my ground. I watched her leave, and even though it felt like a knife twisting in my chest, I knew I had to let her go. I couldn't keep chasing after someone who didn't want me around. It took me a while to calm down after that. I was shaking, and my mind was racing with everything she'd said. But Sarah and her mom were there, reminding me that I didn't need people like that in my life. I had real support, real friends who had my back. In the end, leaving my mom's house was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also the best choice I could have made. It forced me to face the reality of my situation and start building my own life, away from all the negativity. And while it's still tough and there are moments when I miss the idea of a real family, I know now that sometimes the family you choose is the one that really counts.
On a bright morning, Jasmine Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel of her sleek Lamborghini Aventador, her heart racing, not with the thrill of speed, but the weight of her next decision. She glanced at the crisp envelope resting on the passenger seat, containing evidence she knew could destroy lives but also set others free. "Am I ready for this?" she whispered to herself, her pulse quickening. It wasn't fear holding her back, it was the knowledge that once she took this step, there was no going back. As she pulled into the driveway of a pristine office building, the sound of sirens blaring behind her cut through the air like a knife. Jasmine turned, her chest tightening as a white police officer approached, his hand resting on his holster. His smirk carried an arrogance she'd seen too many times, and his first words sent a chill down her spine. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to someone like you." Jasmine's mind raced, balancing the frustration bubbling within her and the calm facade she knew she had to maintain. What he didn't know was that she had planned for this exact moment. The wheels were already in motion. With a subtle nod, she reached for her phone, her expression unchanging. "It's time," she said softly into the receiver, her words igniting the first spark of a plan meticulously crafted to expose a corrupt empire. This is Real Life Stories New, where we unravel the extraordinary battles of ordinary people. Jasmine Carter is about to risk everything, not just to reclaim her dignity but to strike at the very heart of a broken system. What happens next will leave you breathless and questioning everything. Stay with us, and discover the power of a single decision to change the course of justice. The officer's condescending tone, the way his eyes lingered on her as if calculating her worth, and the subtle yet deliberate reach for his badge, every move screamed of power meant to intimidate. Jasmine, however, was not a woman easily shaken. Her heartbeat steadied as she gripped the door handle and stepped out, her tailored blazer catching the morning light. She met his gaze head-on, her voice calm but firm. "Officer, can I help you? You can start by explaining why someone like you is driving a car like this," he said, his smirk revealing the prejudice buried beneath his words. Jasmine felt the familiar surge of anger rise in her chest but quickly suppressed it. She had dealt with men like this before, but this time, she wasn't just reacting, she was ready. She handed over her registration and ID, her movements slow and deliberate, daring him to find a flaw in her actions. The officer, whose name tag read Jack Miller, scanned the documents with an exaggerated skepticism, shaking his head. "Fake papers aren't uncommon these days," he said casually, tossing them back to her. "How exactly did you afford this car?" Her fingers tightened around the papers, but Jasmine didn't flinch. "I worked hard, saved harder, and bought it legally," she said evenly. Then, with a hint of defiance, she added, "If you'd like the receipts, I can provide those too." Jack leaned closer, his smirk widening. "That won't be necessary," he said, stepping toward the car. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area. I'll need to impound this one for further investigation." Jasmine's jaw clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "You're overstepping your authority." "Oh, but I can," Jack replied smugly, slipping into the driver's seat. The roar of the engine echoed through the street as he drove off, leaving Jasmine standing in the aftermath of his arrogance. The phone in her hand vibrated against her palm as she made a call. "He took the bait," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "Activate the system." What Jack didn't know was that the car he so gleefully confiscated wasn't just a luxury vehicle, it was a trap. Jasmine had installed advanced security protocols capable of remote control. Minutes later, as Jack reveled in the car's interior, the dashboard flashed red, "Unauthorized user detected. Activating override." "What the hell?" Jack muttered, his confidence dissolving into panic. He yanked at the steering wheel, but it locked in place. The car slowed, then turned sharply onto an unfamiliar path. Jack's voice cracked as he yelled into his radio for backup, only to be met with static. For the first time in years, he was utterly powerless. When the car came to a halt in front of a desolate warehouse, Jasmine was already waiting. Her sharp heels clicked against the concrete as she approached, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice calm yet commanding. "Welcome to accountability." Jack's bravado faltered as he stepped out of the car. "What is this?" he barked, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster. But before he could act, a large screen behind Jasmine flickered to life, displaying damning footage, every word, every smug smile, every overreach of his authority caught on tape. "You've been abusing your badge for years," Jasmine said, her voice steady but seething with controlled anger. "But today, that ends. This is all fake," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "You're setting me up." Jasmine stepped closer, her eyes piercing. "You think people haven't noticed your behavior? Think again. I'm not the only one who's been watching." The footage shifted to hidden camera clips of Jack's past misdeeds, unprovoked violence, racial profiling, even bribes taken under the guise of authority. The silence in the warehouse was deafening, broken only by Jack's shallow breathing. "You could have been better," Jasmine said, her voice now laced with disappointment. "But you chose this. And now, you'll face the consequences." As she left the warehouse, her mind was already racing ahead to the next target. She knew Jack was a symptom, not the disease. But this moment wasn't just a victory, it was a spark, a signal that the tides were beginning to turn. The night air was cool against her skin as she made one last call. "Laura," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "We've taken the first step. Now, it's time to expose the rest." The dawn crept over the city, painting the skyline in soft hues of gold and crimson. Jasmine stood on the balcony of her safe house, the cool morning air brushing against her face. She gazed at the quiet streets below, her thoughts heavy but resolute. The weight of what she had accomplished, the exposure of Jack Miller and the first crack in Robert Kane's web of corruption, settled in her chest. Yet, she knew this was only the beginning. For the first time in months, Jasmine allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about her father's unwavering belief in justice and how his ideals had shaped her. But the battle with Cain had taught her a harsh truth: justice wasn't a given, it had to be fought for, relentlessly. And sometimes, it meant standing alone in the face of overwhelming darkness. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Laura. The evidence has sparked an investigation into Cain's entire network. Her voice brimmed with cautious optimism. But Jasmine, there's chatter. They're already planning their counterattack. Jasmine exhaled deeply, her lips curving into a faint smile. Let them, she said, her voice steady. They've underestimated us once. They won't do it again. She turned back to face the room where Emily sat, clutching a steaming mug of tea. Jasmine's gaze softened as she walked over and placed a reassuring hand on her sister's shoulder. We're not just fighting for justice anymore, she said quietly. We're fighting for a future where people like you can live without fear. The camera lingered on Jasmine's determined face as she looked back out toward the city, the light of a new day glinting in her eyes. Her words echoed softly, this isn't the end. It's only the first step. If this story has moved you, help us spread the message by hitting like and sharing this video. Let's work together to uncover the truths that matter. And don't forget to subscribe to Real Life Stories New. We're on the verge of reaching 10,000 subscribers, and your support can help us continue telling stories that inspire change. Let's make a difference together.